Luckily, Mr. Harden was there this time, but was very busy and answered our questions as he continued to work. We found out that one of the busts was sold to Mr. Harker of Kensington, one to Mr. Josiah Brown of Chiswick, and the third to Mr. Sandford of Reading, outside of London. After hearing this, we hurried back to Baker Street, as it was getting close to 6 o'clock, and we were supposed to meet Lestrade. Lestrade was there when we arrived. He was a little early and was very excited. "I have some interesting information, Holmes," he said. "What about you? Did you find anything today?" "We learned something about the busts and who bought them all," Holmes said. "Is that all?" Lestrade said, laughing. "I have found out things more important than just the busts." "Is that so?" Holmes said. "What exactly are you talking about?" "I have the identity of the dead man, and I believe I also have the motive for the murder," Lestrade said, smiling. "That is excellent," Holmes said. "Do tell us." "Well," Lestrade began, "one of our detectives of Scotland Yard knows a lot of the Italians in London. He knew of this man and said his name was Pietro Vinucci. Vinucci worked for the mafia and was known to be a dangerous man and also a thief. His job was to kill people who didn't follow the instructions of the mafia. Apparently, the murdered man broke the rules and Vinucci was sent to kill him. But they had a fight and Vinucci lost and died himself." "I understand," Holmes said. "But why do you think the busts were broken?" "Those busts are not important to this case," Lestrade said, raising his voice. "You need to forget about them, Holmes. Breaking a bust will only get a 6-month prison term, but Pietro Vinucci is dead. That is what is important here." "I see," said Holmes. "So what is the next step?" "I am going to the area where all the Italians live and find the man in the photograph. Do you want to come along?" he said. "I don't think so," said Holmes. "I believe we can find him somewhere else." "Really? Where?" Lestrade asked. "If you come with me tonight, I will show you. It is at an address in Chiswick. If we don't find him, I will come with you tomorrow night," Holmes said. Lestrade agreed and we went for an early dinner. After dinner, Holmes told Lestrade and I to rest until 11 o'clock. He did not sleep at all. He sat and read the newspapers. I thought he was probably looking for facts about people or Vinucci. At 10:30 we got up and Holmes was waiting for us. He had his favorite walking stick with him. He asked me to bring my gun. We got a carriage and went to Chiswick, the big house on a dark street. There were no lights on at the house, so the people inside were probably sleeping, I thought. "We have to be very quiet," said Holmes. "I am happy it isn't raining. We may have to wait a while, and we can't make any noise or smoke. I am hoping that we will discover something tonight here." Suddenly, the gate to the garden opened, and we saw a man run quickly towards the house. None of us could see his face because it was so dark, so all we could do was wait. We were very quiet and heard the sound of the window opening. Then we saw a small light in the front of the house. "Come on," Lestrade said. "Let's go to that window." He opened and wait. We can catch him when he tries to leave. Just as we were getting ready to go, The man came out carrying something in his arms. He ran to the wall, looked around and threw the object. There was a loud crash when it broke, with pieces flying nearby. We all ran to the place and Holmes jumped on the man's back, with both falling heavily to the ground. I had my gun ready and pointing it at the man. Lestrade told him to stop. We finally had our prisoner. Holmes began to look at the pieces that were broken of the object the man had thrown against the wall and saw that it was another Napoleon bust. This is exactly what he expected. He examined each piece, holding it up to the light. Just then a light came on in the house and a short, fat man came out. He came to us and said, "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes, right?" "I am," Holmes answered. "I suppose you are Mr. Joshua Brown." "Yes, that's right. I did just as you instructed my man servant earlier today," he answered. We turned off the lights, locked the door, and waited very quietly. "Will you please come in and have something to eat and drink now?" "Maybe another time," Holmes said. "Mr. Lestrade must take the prisoner to Scotland Yard now." On the way we all rode together, but the prisoner said nothing. He was ugly and still angry. Once at Scotland Yard he was searched and the police found a long knife with blood on it and a little money. "Well," Lestrade said, "I thank you for your help, Mr. Holmes. Do you now think I was right with my idea?" "I still think the busts are important," Holmes said. "I have some more things to do. Will you come again to my rooms at 6 o'clock tomorrow?" "I would love to," Lestrade said. "See you tomorrow." On the way home, Holmes said, "Lestrade is a good detective, but he doesn't understand everything about this case. There is more to it than we can see." "What more is there?" I asked. "I know the busts are the most important part of this case. I just have to find out why," he said. The next evening, Lestrade arrived at 6 o'clock as planned. He had learned more about Beppo. He found out that he spent time in prison as a famous thief and had stabbed a man with a knife. We already know this information. Lestrade also said that Beppo was very good at making busts and other types of art. He thought it was possible that he made the Napoleons busts at Gilder and Company. Holmes listened carefully but said nothing. He was smiling. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. An old man carrying a large bag came into the room and put the bag on the table. "Are you Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he said. "Yes, I am," Holmes said. "I supposed you are Mr. Sandford of Reading. Thank you for coming. This is Mr. Lestrade from Scotland Yard and my good friend Dr. Watson." "Nice to meet you," Mr. Sandford said. "Here is the bust of Napoleon you asked me to bring, after I received your letter, Mr. Holmes." The day before, Holmes had written a letter to Mr. Sandford asking for him to bring the bust to Baker Street. He offered in the letter to pay £10 for the busts. Mr. Sandford said, "I didn't pay that much for these busts, Mr. Holmes. I believe you should know that I only paid £1 for it. If you don't want to buy it now, I will understand. That's a big difference in price." "Here is the £10, Holmes said, smiling. "I still want it." Mr. Sandford said, "Suit yourself," and took the money. He opened the bag and took out the Napoleon bust, just like the others. Please, Holmes said, before you leave, would you just sign this paper saying I bought the bust for £10? Mr. Sandford signed the paper and left. After he closed the door, Holmes took a clean white cloth and laid it on the table. He put the bust on the top of the cloth. He then took his walking stick and hit the head. It broke it into a lot of small pieces. Holmes laughed. Just as I thought, he said. He picked up a small black cloth from the pieces. It's the Black Pearl of Borgay, he said. Lestrade and I were amazed, and he said, How did you know? That's not possible, is it? Holmes smiled and said, Yes, it is possible. This is the most famous pearl in the world. It belongs to the Princess of Colonna. It was stolen from her hotel room last year on May 22. Don't you remember when that happened, Lestrade? Of course I remember. But how did you know that it was that pearl? He questioned. I thought this because her hotel was at the same part of London as Gilder and Company. It was also thought that the thief was an Italian waitress that worked at the hotel. Her name was Lucrezia Vinucci. They could never prove it. It was her brother that was killed 2 nights ago, Pietro. I also saw in the newspapers that Beppo was cuffed only 2 days after the pearl was stolen. We were told that the Napoleon busts were made during those 2 days. I don't know who stole the pearl. Perhaps Vinucci took it and Beppo stole it from him. It doesn't really matter. Holmes continued. What I do know for sure is that on the night of Beppo's street fight, he had the pearl. When he ran away and the police followed, he had to hide it. So he went to Gilder's and put it inside one of the busts. They had just been made and were still soft. He pushed the pearl into one and covered the hole. No one would think to look there. When Beppo was in prison that year from the street fight, the 6 busts were sold. So when Beppo got out, he got a job with Morse Hudson to find the names of the buyers of the busts. Then he started his search for the correct bust to find the hidden pearl. After he broke the first bust, he then went to Dr. Barnicot's busts. He still didn't find the pearl after breaking those 3. The other 3 busts were sold to Mr. Hardin for his shop. I don't know how people found out who had bought the busts from there. Maybe he had an Italian friend to help him. During this time, Vinucci had heard Beppo was out of prison and started to look for him. He followed Beppo to Mr. Harker's house because he knew that Beppo was searching for the pearl. A fight happened and Vinucci was killed. But if Beppo and Vinucci knew each other, why did Vinucci carry a photograph of Beppo? I asked. To show people in order to find Beppo, Holmes said. At first, I wasn't sure if Beppo had found the pearl or not at Harker's, but I knew that if he didn't, there were only 2 more busts that he could find in it. One in Chiswick and the other in Reading. Since Chiswick is closer than Reading, I asked Josiah Brown to prepare himself for a break-in. Just as I thought, Beppo went to the Browns for the busts. When we cuffed him and there was no pearl, I knew it had to be in Mr. Sandford's busts, Holmes said, smiling. He continued, since the article is in the newspaper was written, everyone, including the police, was looking for a Napoleon-hating crazy man. People must have read it and thought no one knew the truth. When I heard the name Venucci, I remembered the robbery of the pearl and knew then what had happened. Lestrade has been listening carefully and finally said, Holmes, this is one of your best. I know my friends at Scotland Yard will be very interested in hearing it. Can you come tomorrow and explain how you solved this case? I would be happy to, Holmes said. Thank you again, Lestrade said. I can't begin to tell you how much you have helped me, and you have also found the famous Black Pearl. Holmes just smiled and then looked at me and said, Well, Watson, we had better go. We have more cases to solve. We need to get to work. Lestrade, if you have any more need of my assistance, please tell me. I am always delighted to help if I can.